All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are diving into some of psychology's darkest moments. We're talking about experiments that caused real, lasting harm and how that dark history forced the creation of the strict ethical rules that protect all of us today. It's a wild story about the search for knowledge and the unbelievable price that was sometimes paid to get it. So, this is the question that really sits at the heart of our story today. How far is too far? Without a clear answer, some researchers pushed the boundaries of morality way past the breaking point. We're going to look at a few of these studies, because to really understand why our modern rules are so important, you first have to see just how bad things could get without them. Okay, so let's step back in time. We're talking about the early 20th century, which was basically the Wild West of psychological research. There were hardly any formal rules, no oversight committees, nothing like that. A researcher's ambition was often the only thing guiding their methods. And as you're about to see, that was a huge problem. Our first stop is 1920, with a psychologist named John Watson. Now, he had this idea he wanted to prove, that a powerful emotion, like fear, isn't something we're born with, but something that can be conditioned into us. And his test subject? An unsuspecting 9-month-old baby. The way they did this was just horrifying. Every time little Albert would reach for a perfectly harmless, fuzzy white rat, Watson would sneak up behind him and slam a hammer into a steel bar. That loud, terrifying noise again and again. And, well, it worked. Pretty soon, just the sight of the rat was enough to make Albert cry. But the biggest ethical failure here was what they didn't do. They never reversed it. They sent this poor child away with a newly manufactured phobia, with absolutely no concern for the long-term harm they'd caused. So, if experimenting on an infant isn't bad enough for you, our next case targets an even more vulnerable group: orphans. Yep. In 1939, a study was done at the University of Iowa that eventually earned the pretty grim nickname, the Monster Study. This quote, it just cuts right to the heart of the damage they caused. The researchers wanted to see if they could actually induce a stutter in kids who spoke perfectly fine just by using negative psychological pressure. The impact was, you guessed it, immediate and devastating. Here's how it worked. They split 22 orphans into two groups. One group got praise and positive reinforcement. The other group was relentlessly criticized. They were told they were stutterers, that their speech was terrible. And while it didn't really induce a stutter, it absolutely shattered their self-esteem. I mean, this is the textbook definition of exploiting a vulnerable population. These were kids who couldn't consent and had no one looking out for their best interests. All right, let's jump forward to 1961 at Yale University. A psychologist named Stanley Milgram was fascinated by obedience to authority. He wanted to know, how far would an ordinary person go in obeying an order if it meant hurting someone else? The results? Well, they would absolutely shock the world. Just look at this number, 65%. What does that even mean? It means that 2/3 of the people in this study, regular, everyday people like you or me, were willing to administer what they thought was a final, massive 450-volt electric shock to another human being. Why? Simply because a guy in a lab coat told them they had to. The whole thing was built on deception. The learner getting shocked was actually an actor, and the shocks were totally fake. But the subject, the teacher, believed it was all 100% real. They heard screams, they heard pleas to stop, and then they heard a dead, chilling silence. The ethical failure here is just massive. It inflicted extreme psychological distress, leaving people to walk away believing they might have actually killed someone. That kind of trauma is very, very real. And that brings us to 1971 and to what is maybe the most infamous study of all time. The psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to see how social roles can shape our behavior. So he built a fake prison in the basement of Stanford University, and he paid college students to be either prisoners or guards. Things went off the rails almost immediately. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but they had to shut it down after only 6 days. The students, who were randomly assigned to be guards, became genuinely sadistic. The prisoners started showing signs of extreme emotional breakdown. That line between an experiment and actual abuse just completely vanished. So, all of these horrific studies, plus others like the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, created a massive crisis. The scientific community had to face a pretty harsh reality. They couldn't just keep operating like this. The chaos had to stop. They needed a real, formal code of conduct.
The answer finally came in the 1970s with something called the Belmont Report. And listen, this wasn't just some academic paper. This was a landmark document that laid out the fundamental ethical principles that, to this day, govern all research involving human beings. This was the turning point. The whole report is built on 3 simple but incredibly powerful ideas, and each one is a direct response to the disasters we just talked about. First, you've got respect for persons. This means people are not just guinea pigs. They have to be fully informed about what they're getting into and freely consent to participate. This is what would have protected the orphans in the monster study. Second, there's beneficence. This is basically the do no harm rule. It's a direct counter to the permanent fear conditioned into little Albert and the trauma inflicted on Milgram's subjects. And finally, there's justice. This says you have to distribute the risks and benefits of research fairly. You can't just target vulnerable groups, like those orphans, and make them bear all the risks for everyone else's potential gain.
Okay, so principles are great on paper, but how do you actually enforce them? How do you make sure another Stanford prison experiment can never happen again? Well, that's where the modern-day gatekeepers come in. Today, pretty much every single institution that does research, we're talking universities, hospitals, you name it, has something called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. You can basically think of them as the ethics police for research. Before any scientist can even start a study, their entire plan has to be reviewed and approved by the IRB. Their whole job is to make sure those Belmont principles are being followed to the letter.
And who are these gatekeepers? Well, an IRB isn't just a room full of other scientists. By law, it has to be a diverse group. There has to be at least one person who's a non-scientist, like a lawyer or a member of the clergy, and at least one person who isn't even affiliated with the institution. This whole setup ensures that there's an independent review that's focused not just on the science, but on the human impact.
So when you put it all together, the difference between then and now is just night and day. Back then, no review, consent was optional, psychological harm is common, and vulnerable groups were easy targets. Today, IRB review is mandatory, informed consent is a basic right, all risks have to be minimized, and there are special protections in place for those vulnerable groups. It is truly a completely different world. Now, it might be tempting to think, okay, great, we fixed the problem, story's over. But the need for ethical vigilance didn't just stop in the 1970s. The challenges didn't go away, they just changed.
Think about it. Today's ethical battles are often digital and way more subtle. How do we protect your data privacy when your entire life is online? How do we handle sensitive medical information? And really importantly, how do we start to rebuild trust with communities that were so terribly harmed by unethical research in the past? These questions are every bit as important as stopping the obvious abuses of the old days. And that really brings us to the big, lingering question for right now. The Belmont Report was designed for a world of lab coats and clipboards. But in our new era of big data, AI, and machine learning, are those same principles enough? Are our current ethics committees equipped to spot the bias in an algorithm? That is the challenge for the next generation of researchers, and for all of us, really. It definitely gives you a lot to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.